What's up guys, my name is Ace, and the Season 2 mid-season update for Cold War is here, and with this we saw quite a few weapon balancing changes. So of course, in today's video, I'm going to be covering all of these changes, and instead of just reading the patch notes, I'm actually going to be going into great detail here, showing you guys before and after, whenever possible and whenever it makes sense. And hopping right into it, let's start it off with the Krig 6. They've apparently reworked the Krig 6 in quite a few ways. The first thing they did here is they improved visibility while firing in ADS. And for my test here, I purposely went into a darker area, and honestly, I'm not seeing much difference pre-patch versus post-patch. It looks like the muzzle smoke and the muzzle flash is pretty much the same pre-patch versus post-patch. And while the recoil definitely changed, which we'll look at in just a little bit, I honestly don't see where the visibility is any better while aiming down sight and firing, at least with iron sights here. As for our recoil change, it wasn't a massive change by any means here, but it seems like there is a little bit less horizontal recoil post-patch now with the Krig 6, and it doesn't bounce side to side as much either, so you get more of a straight vertical line. It still deviates a little bit and kicks a little to the left to begin with, but not as much as it used to. But moving on to the next assault rifle that got a change, this is the FFAR, and with this one, they increased its bullet velocity from 625 meters per second up to 705. And this is definitely a noticeable change, and it's a nice change. However, I don't really think it's the right change for the FFAR. With the way that the recoil is on the FFAR in multiplayer, it's not like this is a long-range gun anyway, and you really will only notice this bullet velocity change in longer-range engagements. So it just seems like a really strange change to me, but in either case, it did get a buff when it comes to bullet velocity. Next, we have the Groza, and with this one, they increased its maximum damage range by 40%. So this went from 38 meters up to 53 meters. And again, this seems like a little bit of a strange change to me. Just like with the FFAR, the Groza is not really a long-range gun. So it seems strange to me that they're buffing these guns at longer ranges when that's really not where they're designed to excel. But now let's move on to the SMG category, and the first one we got here is the Milano 821. The first thing they did to this is they boosted the mid damage from 30 up to 33. Now this doesn't change the number of shots to kill to the body, it's still going to be a 5-shot kill in this range. All it does now is it makes it so it requires 2 headshots mixed in with a body shot to get a 4-shot kill instead of 3, which is what it was pre-patch. Now additionally, with this mid damage range, they increased this from 24 meters up to about 32 meters. Then our stated sprint out time went from 350 milliseconds down to 300 milliseconds, which is a buff. However, when you actually test this in-game, this turned out to be a bit of a nerf. Our actual in-game experience sprint out time went from 233 milliseconds up to 250 milliseconds. So not a huge nerf or anything, but just know this technically slowed down instead of being sped up. Next up with the Milano, they increased our raise speed a little bit, so the amount of time it takes to bring the gun up when you're swapping weapons or after using equipment, for instance. And this went from 417 milliseconds down to 383 milliseconds, which is a little bit of a buff. But finally on the Milano, the aim down sight time was improved just slightly. It went from 250 milliseconds down to 233 milliseconds. So overall, a few nice changes to the Milano. I don't think this is going to suddenly make this gun top tier or anything. It's still going to be one of the weaker SMGs in the game, but it's just slightly better than it was before this patch. As for the next SMG, this is the KSP-45, and with this one, they improved the bullet velocity from 200 meters per second up to 265 meters per second, which is great. And on top of this, they reduced the burst delay by 20%. And what this means is if you're spamming the KSP-45, you can hardly even notice a burst delay anymore. And this is crazy. I personally thought pre-patch the KSP in the right hands with the right setup was already a dominant gun. Now it's even better, and I'm a bit worried this is going to create a balance issue. If you guys haven't tried the KSP yet post-patch, give it a shot. You're probably going to love it. After that, though, we've got the AK-74U, and the first thing they did here is they reduced accuracy with prolonged firing. And just looking at the recoil pattern pre-patch versus post-patch, there's definitely a noticeable change here. The overall shape of the recoil pattern has changed a decent amount, so the recoil on the initial bullets is going to be a little bit higher. And just overall, the 74U is now going to be quite a bit more difficult to control when trying to pick people off at longer ranges. Additionally, with the 74U, they reduced the bullet velocity from 500 meters per second down to 383 meters per second. Now, this is still quite fast for an SMG. This is faster than most of the other SMGs still, but it is noticeably slower than it used to be. So just overall, the 74U is going to be less effective at longer ranges against assault rifles. As for the next SMG that changed, this is the LC-10, and with this one, they gave it a pretty considerable nerf to its maximum damage range. As you can see here, it went from about 21 meters down to 12.7 meters. And that is a pretty big difference there, so the LC-10 is going to be much less effective than it was pre-patch, although I still think it's going to be a very usable gun. However, that's talking about core game modes. Another thing they did is they reduced the mid damage from 28 down to 27, which has no impact on core game modes, but when you bring that into hardcore game modes, it basically destroyed this gun. Pre-patch, our one-shot kill potential with the LC-10 was ridiculous at like 51 meters, and now it's only 12.7 meters. So this is no longer that top-tier dominant gun for hardcore modes. But finally for SMGs, the MAC-10 got a bit of a nerf to its recoil, which I was surprised to see since this already has by far the most recoil in the entire game. But what they did here is they just added a little bit more horizontal recoil. So pre-patch it kicked pretty much straight upwards with a little bit of side-to-side bounce, whereas post-patch it now kicks upward and to the right to begin with, so it's going to be a bit harder to compensate for that recoil. Now, moving on to the LMG category, the only LMG that was changed with this update is the Stoner 63. And with this one, they just reduced its 4-shot kill range from about 51 meters down to 38 meters, which is a noticeable change for sure. However, I was quite surprised to see that they didn't touch the hipfire spread on the LMGs at all. All of the LMGs are still going to be just as good as SMGs while hipfiring, which I still think is crazy. But moving on to sniper rifles, a nice thing they did here is you finally don't have scope glint when you're not using a scope, when you're just using the iron sights. You used to have scope glint, which just made no sense at all because there's no optic to reflect anything. Now you won't have that glint if you're using the iron sight on a sniper rifle. Then getting into the pistol category, the 1911 got improved aim down sight time from 225 milliseconds down to 200 milliseconds, which is hardly even noticeable, but I guess it's a nice little buff. I'm quite surprised to see that they even buffed this because it's already a very powerful pistol. And now let's move into the Magnum. They've done a few things with the Magnum here. The first thing they mentioned is they slightly decreased the hipfire accuracy. However, I did look at this pre-patch versus post-patch, both while standing still as well as while moving, so the min and the max hipfire spread, and it doesn't appear to have changed at all. Additionally, with the dual-wield attachment specifically, they mentioned that they changed the bullet trajectory to be more varied when firing both guns simultaneously. And I put this to the test at 7 meters using all of the attachments that you would tend to use if you're using the dual Magnum. So it does have the 5 milliwatt laser equipped, for instance. And as you can see, pre-patch versus post-patch, there's really not that much of a difference at all here. I really don't think this is something that's going to change the effectiveness of the Akimbo Magnums. Now, just to be thorough, I also wanted to test this when alternating firing both guns. So you're not firing them simultaneously, you're firing one at a time. And once again, I didn't really notice a significant difference in the amount of spread that you're getting with your shots. So at the end of the day, it looks like the Akimbo Magnums are still going to be incredibly powerful to use. Now, one last thing they did to the Magnum is they completely reworked one of the barrels. They turned the 4.7-inch takedown barrel, which gave us a 60% increase to our damage range. They turned that into the tight snub barrel, which has completely different properties, so this is a whole new barrel here. And with this, it improves our damage by 21%, giving us a 91 damage for a body shot, which is pretty impressive, but it's still a 2-shot kill, just like it is without this barrel. And it doesn't give it a 1-shot headshot potential either. So realistically speaking, that increase to damage doesn't really change the effectiveness of this gun overall against enemy players, unless they happen to be hurt just the right amount. However, we do get a massive 285% increase to vehicle damage, which may be useful in some situations. I tried testing this against a UAV. It still takes like 5 or 6 shots to take down a UAV, which is not bad for a pistol, but it's also quite hard to even hit the UAV in the first place. So if you're planning on using a secondary to take down UAVs, you're still better off with a launcher here. But on top of this, with this new attachment, our effective damage range is reduced by 30%, and we get reduced horizontal recoil control as well. Now that pretty much wraps it up for the actual gun changes. Now let's move on to the RPG. This one got a slightly increased blast radius, which in my testing, the maximum radius at which you're able to hit an enemy player and deal damage is still 5 meters. It doesn't appear that this has changed at all, or at least not by a noticeable margin. However, they did make it so if you hit like right next to an enemy player's foot without directly impacting them, if they don't have flak jacket, you can now get a 1-shot kill, whereas pre-patch you would only deal 145 damage. However, a much bigger and more noticeable buff they made to the RPG is it simply shoots much straighter than it used to. So in my pre-patch testing here, I stood 72 meters away from this vertical stabilizer. I aimed at the last 0 on that number, And you can see pre-patch my hits were kind of all over the vertical stabilizer. There was a lot of randomness involved here. It just wasn't very precise. And this is what made it so hard to shoot down UAVs with the RPG for the camo challenges. Now, post-patch, standing in the exact same spot and aiming at that 0, it is pinpoint accurate every single time. I'm hitting right on that 0 with every rocket I fire. And this is actually a massive buff to the RPG. It's now going to be so much easier to directly impact players, which you'll need to do against flak jacket players. There's no randomness involved, so you can just aim on your target and you'll get the hits. And now it's also going to be so much easier to shoot down UAVs, which is amazing to see. Now, on top of this, for both of the launchers, they make them deal more damage to enemies that have flak jacket on in hardcore game modes. So now, as long as the rocket is hitting relatively close to your target in hardcore modes, it should only take you 2 rockets to kill a flak jacket player instead of 3 like it used to. In core game modes, it's still going to take you 3 though. Now, we're almost through the changes here, but there's a few more that I wanted to cover. One thing they did with this update is they slightly reduced the speed of changing stances. Now, I didn't check every single stance change, like stand to crouch, crouch to stand to prone, prone to stand, all of those. I didn't do every single one of them, but just to show you guys one example of it here, going from a stand to a crouch, pre-patch, it would take 217 milliseconds. Post-patch, it now takes 300 milliseconds. So what this is designed to do is just prevent snaking, which is something that people at really high levels of play can take advantage of, that basically just screws with the camera angles and the netcode and makes people nearly impossible to shoot off of a head glitch when they're doing this. So this should make snaking a little bit less effective than it used to be without really changing the feel for the average player too much. And with that, there's one final thing to mention, and this is something they mentioned in the patch notes, but they didn't go into great detail with. For both SMGs as well as assault rifles, they did a complete tuning pass on muzzle and underbarrel attachments that affect recoil. And with this, it varies from gun to gun based on what I've seen. I didn't look at absolutely every single gun and attachment pre-patch and post-patch, but I did notice for some guns, they actually buffed the recoil attachments, like the Krig 6 here with the foregrip, for instance. That actually got a bit of a buff, whereas with the AK-47, some of its attachments got a slight nerf to its recoil control. And we saw the exact same story with the SMG recoil attachments. So while the overall behavior of these attachments are still exactly the same, some of the values have been altered a little bit. So if you notice maybe a slight change to the recoil on your particular setup that you like using, it's likely due to one of its recoil attachments getting a bit of a change. And with that, that finally wraps it up for all of the mid-season weapon balancing changes that we got with this update. Of course, I'd like to know in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on all of these balancing changes? Are you generally happy with the changes they've made, or are you unhappy with any? Just let me know those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.